Okay, I think we should start now. We'll have this paper and then really just 5-minute break before the last paper of the day. And I think we're all here now, so we should start. It's a pleasure to introduce Brett Steele, who is going to give a paper. I'm afraid someone misset the title of the paper. It's not the Leven House, it's the Lever House, a clean diagram. Brett was trained as an architect. He runs the DRL here, the graduate design program, and before that taught at the Harvard Graduate Design School. I'd like you to welcome Brett Steele.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And in addition to not being called Leven House, it's also not a house at all, and I'll be talking about today. It's actually an office building from about 50 years ago, which I think in the context of this conference offers an interesting episode in a kind of transformation in the 20th century of both space and the subject, to the point that I think they're almost kind of indistinguishable anymore. And the paper I'm going to deliver today is an episode in a larger project I've been doing with my students for this past year, and it'll go on for another 6 months, that we've been calling brand space. Let's see if I can get these two. Oops, sorry. Got them. Which has been looking at the transformation of both city and product, and the ways in which the stuff we take to be space, city, buildings, are becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the stuff we call kind of products, brands, labels, personalities, identities. And my part of the brand space project this year has been really to write a kind of history of this sort of transformation. And it's one that I'm trying very hard to write as deliberately a kind of episodic story. And today's story that I'm going to be telling is one of those episodes, and it's the episode of the building of a project called Lever House, which I think demonstrates its kind of exaggerated cartoonish qualities, many of the also exaggerated forces that are at play in the making of these kind of projects today. My interest in writing the history the way I am is actually to show that the arrival of this kind of brand space phenomena that's being talked about a lot today isn't the kind of catastrophic or traumatic event that we might take it to be in the last few years, despite the kind of overnight appearance of Starbucks across the landscape of London or something like that. But it's much more that like modernism itself, it kind of installs itself in a slightly different way, in a very episodic manner, in which the appearance of that kind of brand space has shifted dramatically over the years. The episode I'm going to address today is situated between these two portraits. On the left is a portrait of New York in 1913. On the right is a portrait of the artist by Andy Warhol about 50 years later in 1963. And the building I'm going to be showing was built in 1950 and offers a kind of if not visually clear, in terms of its surface, a kind of smooth transition between these two worlds. So the story itself. The story starts 40 years ago, almost exactly, and conveniently enough in this room, when Philip Johnson came to the AA to deliver a lecture on the 28th of November in 1960. And he began the talk, as he kind of famously always did, with a sort of joke. And referring to the taxi ride to Bedford Square that had just brought him here, Johnson began that lecture with the following line. We managed to pass 3 lever houses along the way from Paddington, each one worse than the one before. I guess as a kind of attack on English architecture. He went on to say that if you go to Germany, you will see local versions of Lever House, and they're actually worse. And I thought, given the age of the audience, it would be useful to see what Johnson was referring to, although he wouldn't have had to illustrate the talk at the time. I pulled out a couple of these buildings that existed on Johnson's taxi ride between Paddington and here. This is the building he's referring to. This is Lever House, the icon I'll be talking about. It was built in 1950 to 1952 by the world's largest corporation, the first multinational corporation in the world, a company called Unilever, which is headquartered still on the banks of the Thames across from the new Tate Bankside Gallery. It was built as what they called a huge marketing promotion to provide an image for their U.S. subsidiary called Lever Brothers. The buildings that Johnson was referring to were these kind of things, which were built along Euston Road in many other places in London and in cities across the world in the years right after the kind of worldwide publication of the images of Lever House. I pulled out just a couple, and these are examples from the Brand Space seminar. There's a session I do called Buildings That Suck, which is a chance to kind of go through in an hour a series of buildings like this, which is sort of bad versions of otherwise famous buildings. One of those one part of that story is this part on Lever House. So within 2 or 3 years of these sort of images on the left being published of Lever House, what happens on the right is a kind of proliferation of Lever Houses. It's almost kind of promiscuity and not proliferation, actually. It's like Lever House starts sleeping with other buildings and little Lever Houses appear everywhere. On the right is Basil Spence's Lever House, built in the city in London in the late 1950s, and I just wanted to pull out one of the kind of images that he used to actually promote that image and show how close this kind of act of appropriation was. Oh, sorry, I pulled a couple of images also to show that it wasn't just a kind of English phenomenon Johnson was referring to. In America, too, there's a kind of carpet of Lever Houses built right after it appears. This sort of generic building on the left in Los Angeles. On the right, SOM itself kind of proliferated these Lever Houses, and this is a first sketch for what Gordon Boonshoff called a really big Lever House in this stage of study for Chase Manhattan Bank, which SOM eventually built for David Rockefeller a few years after Lever House. In fact, there's kind of little Lever House cities that pop up on the right in Philadelphia, or on the left, a Lever House city next to the United Nations that was being studied at the time. In addition to this kind of proliferation of Lever Houses, there's a sort of mirror world of the project, which is almost its kind of perfect opposite, and that's a sort of erasure of the building. And that erasure really appears in what we call written histories of architecture, modern architecture, which over the years has kind of demonstrated, and I won't go through them in detail here, the kind of citations that demonstrate this, but a kind of gradual erosion and disappearance of the building itself, and the history is taken to be modern architecture. And it begins in the 1950s itself with a young Vincent Scully who dismisses the building, writing of it as just, quote, a typical Bauhaus object, freestanding, shiny, weightless, asymmetrical, fundamentally non-urban. It both cuts the first serious hole in Park Avenue as a street and creates an unusable plaza of its own below it. And Scully's assessment of the project is mirrored at the same time, interestingly, by the people he refers to. While Scully calls it a derivative Bauhaus object, the Bauhaus architect himself, Walter Gropius, attacks it from a completely different angle. Gropius says in a 1952 piece in the Age of Science, Architecture in the Age of Science, Gropius attacks the building for its kind of cosmetic, superficial appearance. He says, quote, we are infected with a slip-cover civilization as things stand now, and our sense of beauty has turned into a timid and insipid attitude which offers us imitative cosmetic skin treatment as a substitute for creatively conceived design. What Gropius is referring to, for the non-architects, just to explain briefly how the building is constructed, what Gropius is annoyed with is the fact that the all-glass, if I can figure out, the all-glass facade of the building here really is a kind of cosmetic addition to a traditional modern high-rise building in New York, which had been built for several decades. The building itself, the superstructure of the building is a steel column beam and column system with a concrete decking and a masonry parapet at each floor, which is required still by high-rise codes, of course, so that flames don't sort of jump between floors in a high-rise building. And attached to that, the architects of Lever House basically just applied a piece of glass. It's a piece of glass that in this sort of position becomes the window out, but obviously here is and I think it's a kind of early first version of this sort of sensibility, a window to a wall that's right behind that glass. This sort of attack on Lever House by historians and writers in modern architecture continues. And I'll skip through some of the examples, and there have been many interesting ones in which the building kind of disappears from written histories. And this gradual erasure of Lever House sort of reaches its logical conclusion in Kenneth Frampton's 1980 Modern Architecture, A Critical History, in which he ignores the building entirely. At the end of one of his concluding chapters, Frampton labels the entire post-war office building boom activity as, in his words, merely a normative mode of corporate building from 1950 to 75, in which all architects failed to arrive at a fresh point of departure. And Frampton makes clear that all of the architecture at that time sort of owes its appearance to the work of Mies. And as historians do, kind of constructs an image of 25 years in which originality itself sort of disappears from the planet. In addition to Frampton's assessment, someone like Manfredo Tafuri has written much the same thing, both of the period and of the building, which also doesn't really appear in his history of modern architecture. Tafuri writes that, quote, the period offered little more than a simplification of the international style, which is basically an architecture of the bureaucracy increasing vastly facilitated demand. In Tafuri's history, in fact, like many others, Lever House isn't even illustrated on its own and appears actually just as part of an image for another building, which is, of course, the famous Seagram's building across the street. And sorry, these images are showing, in fact, buildings built in the same manner as Lever House with a very different kind of appearance, whether it's the, on the right, project by McKim Eden White, which sits next door to Lever House and is constructed in the same traditional New York way. It's a palazzo for the New York Racquet Club that McKim Eden White built. Or on the left, a building that's built in the very same year as Lever House uses exactly the same superstructure of the building, which is steel columns, steel beams, concrete floors, and a piece of cladding. And what Walt Disney does on the left, of course, is just clad that structure in a completely different material. So like Tafuri's history of modern architecture, I tried to pull a couple of examples of Lever House appearing. These were actually the images that first drew my attention to the project a few years ago, because it was the only building I knew of where it actually appeared as an image in images of other famous buildings, you know, kind of crowding in on the image. These are images of Seagram's building across the street, in which you can look, and I've cropped the photograph so that you can see it, but through the glass lobby of Mises building, you can kind of find Lever House crowding its way in. Johnson obviously offers a very different kind of sensibility of the building. In fact, before he came to the AA in 1960, a few years before that, he wrote about Lever House that it was perhaps the best building of the modern style in New York, a weightless prism in which architectural order is expressible by clean column spacing below. And really the scheme for this talk then is this kind of split between the apparent proliferation of the building as a kind of image which gets built over and over worldwide, and this kind of gradual erasure of the building from the histories taken to be that modern architecture. Interestingly, Johnson's above assessment of Lever captures the key to its formula, that is, its equation of architectural order, modernism, and cleanliness. As reported in the New York Times, the following day, after his speech commemorating the formal opening of Lever on April 29, 1952, the mayor of New York unveiled a bronze plaque mounted on a column of the building. It read, in part, the mission of the company is to make cleanliness commonplace, to lessen work for women, and to contribute to personal attractiveness. By installing the world's first ever all-glass sealed high-rise building facade, the architects of Lever solved one problem while creating another, obviously the surface's maintenance. SOM, the architects of the building, arrived at a solution for this following a 6-month study of existing systems. Working with associated mechanical engineers on the Otis Elevator Company, SOM designed a roof-hung, mechanized gondola which allowed cleaners to move freely about its sealed surface. As the Times reported, such a system was in itself totally new, but did include many innovations, such as its attachment to a fixed perimeter rooftop track system. just to show you a couple of images of that system, which I won't go into in any kind of great technical depth, although it has a kind of interesting technological history. And I think some of the images will make it clear, but it's a suspended gondola that two window cleaners ride basically up and down the facade of the building, cleaning that sealed glass. A traditional New York high-rise building with its casement windows would usually just be thrown open, and it's still to this day clean this way. A person with a leather belt just leans out the building, attaches the belt to it, and cleans the window on the outside. Obviously, the construction of this sealed glass facade at Lever required a different kind of system. Countless headlines in newspapers and magazines record the degree to which this cleanliness aspect of the building captured public imagination. An article in Business Week in 1952 titled "Spacious, Efficient, and Washable" refers to the building as dazzlingly clean, reporting that the structure's shiny appearance suggests that cleanliness itself was clearly, for the architects, something of a fetish. A front-page story in the New York Times published the same year, and featuring a photo of the building's automated window mechanism in use, was titled, quote, "Window Washers," this is a front-page article in the Times, "Window Washers in Gondola Speed Clean Glass Building." And then went into a kind of detailed technical explanation of how it worked. Another Times article went further, reporting that the building had a, quote, "clean, efficient, and businesslike look." Lewis Mumford, like many writers of the time, was simply ecstatic. In a piece titled "Clean," he told his readers that Lever was not only beautiful, but so sudsy clean, so wash-a-day bright, that people won't be able to take their eyes off of it. Which ended up proving exactly right. The spectacle of a building bathing itself became, briefly, such a popular event in New York that the Times began publishing a weekly washing schedule for these two guys living in the building. There's other evidence also. The Times reports in another article that soon after the building opened, taxi drivers stopped driving up and down Park Avenue for fear of both encountering the mob and what they said would be the really bright reflections off the shiny surface that would hamper their driving. New York cabbies' assessment of the building. And as other evidence of the kind of unexpected fallout of the publicity of the building, neighboring owners of Lever House filed suit the year of its opening, fearing that the shiny reflection of the building would hamper their office workers in the surrounding buildings. To briefly historicize this popular reception of Lever House, during what Rayner Banham called the detergent decade, which was one of the names given to the 1950s, when it wasn't called the Jet Age, Banham describes the tremendous impact of new everyday technological innovation, interestingly by citing the housewife as one of its new experts. This is Banham writing in Theory and Design of the First Machine Age in 1960. Yeah, 1960. Banham writes, quote, "Even a housewife who does not possess a washing machine dispenses synthetic detergent from the synthetic plastic packs onto synthetic fabrics whose quality and performance makes the jealously guarded secrets of silk seem trivial." Since the 1920s, a concerted nationwide campaign known as the American Cleanliness Crusade, and sponsored by the Association of American Soap and Glycerin Products, including its well-known trade association, the Cleanliness Institute, sought above all to create new consumer cleanliness habit. And just to say briefly, the crusade itself grew out of the Soap Manufacturers Association concern about the rise of basically competing products, particularly the rise of the perfume industry in the 1920s in the States, which the soap manufacturers quite rightly thought was a kind of threat to the need to clean people. You know, that people would smell better anyway, so they wouldn't buy as much soap. So they, invented this program that made people buy more soap. The New York Times, like other leading newspapers and magazines, joined in the campaign, this cleanliness crusade, which it promoted in one of its editorials. And this explains also in part how Lever appears so prominently in the New York Times a couple of decades later. This is the Times writing, "The American standard of cleanliness has not been attained or even thought desirable by thousands of its citizens. To this extent of the population that are unaware of the blessings of sanitary conveniences, to make them discontented with their unwashed condition, and then to supply them with running water, open plumbing, and soap, What could be more progressive? By targeting school children especially, the Cleanliness Institute sought, in its words, the establishment of, quote, lifelong cleanliness habits. And by any measure, the campaign was wildly successful. A published Scripps Howard survey confirms that by 1938, soap is second only to butter as a product found in the American home, which in a way accounts for, in the 1950s, alongside Leverhouse, the arrival of what you'd call probably kind of more penetrating analyses of soap and cleanliness itself. And I'll cite just two of those today. The first one by Hannah Arendt, who was in New York in the 1950s and writes in her 1951 Origins of Totalitarianism an analysis of soap advertisements, amongst other things, for the ways in which they demonstrate, in her words, a central negative aspect of the political post-war environment. Arendt writes in that book, quote, at stake in these ads is the portrayal of a world fundamentally flawed until the application of a certain correction, that is, a bar of soap. Soap is a product whose potential is its, quote, power of alteration, which to Arendt resonates with new forms of political power defined as well by their capacity for alteration. Writing in the same year as Arendt, Roland Barthes brings us back to Leverhouse much more directly. In his essay titled Soap Powders and Detergents, which was published in his 1957 book Mythologies, Barthes focuses on two everyday cleansing products, Persil and Omo. One of them was a soap powder and the other was a liquid detergent. In his essay, Barthes goes so far as to equate soap with the world it cleanses, writing, quote, soap powder keeps order, not unlike the world itself with its dirt. Barthes' essay goes on, describing in detail the very language of soap advertisements and the role it plays in creating new everyday myths. Barthes closes that essay with a direct allusion to Leverhouse. The last sentence of his essay reads, there is one plane on which Persil and Omo are one and the same, the place of the Anglo-Dutch trust Unilever. To understand better Leverhouse, one can thus briefly consider the path suggested by Barthes. Unilever was, in addition to the world's leading manufacturer of cleansing products, a very different kind of client than architects were used to working for, one which constructed, I'd like to suggest, a very different kind of architecture and a very different kind of architect. At the time, the world's most international corporation and the world's first truly multinational organization, Unilever was, in Fortune magazine's words, the most complex business organization in history. Having grown, and very much unlike American corporations like General Motors or U.S. Steel, having grown through merger and acquisition in dozens of competing industries and in hundreds of locations around the world. Unilever was so big, in fact, that Fortune felt that the future of capitalism itself depended upon it. This is from an article they published in December of 1947, a three-part article which was then put together in a book by Unilever. Fortune writes, regarding the post-war success of capitalism, will inevitably be one of the success of Unilever will inevitably be one of the biggest single factors in determining the fortunes of capitalism abroad. And it's worth just briefly considering the size of the company. These are some of the diagrams that are published as a part of those Fortune articles, and this is the kind of, this is what Prada would probably like to become after the sort of diagrams Rem was showing last night, a kind of coverage that's considerably greater than a few showrooms around the world. And there are a series of diagrams that Fortune publishes in the analysis as a way for businessmen in America to try and understand the complexity of the company. But regarding its size alone, Unilever at the time employed 200,000 people in 337 factories and offices located around the world. And to give that a kind of scale, that's about 3 times the size of this year's announcement of AOL and Time Warner combining with its workforce of 70,000 people. It controlled at the time 12% of the world's soap consumption and had products, Fortune reported, in 2/3 of all bathrooms in the world at the time. Now, its largest subsidiary was called the United Africa Company, and it owned properties in Africa that were larger in area than the continental United States, from which it grew the raw goods for the soap and other products that it made. And just briefly, before going on to the architects, the other important part of Unilever is that in fact it's the company that many people credit as inventing the modern commodity. William Lever, who was an Englishman in the 19th century, came up with the idea of packaging soap by cutting it off from the bars that grocers sold it with at the time, and he put it in a wrapper and labeled it Sunshine and sold it with the world's first widespread advertising campaign, which had a notorious slogan, which advertising agencies still refer to, that read, "Why does a woman grow older faster than a man?" Within 2 years of him packaging it, it took off. So this calculated attention to the requisites of marketing of a product can be seen half a century later as the diagram driving the making of Lever House. Charles Luckman, who was the CEO of Lever Brothers, which was the American subsidiary of Unilever at the time, one of 500 companies owned by Unilever, writes in his memoirs that Unilever commissioned Lever House for one reason only, to create an image of a U.S. company and in fact counter the reality of its overseas ownership. Like many multinationals, during the war Unilever had too big a stake in Germany and other Axis countries to simply divest its holdings. So it basically laid low in Germany, operating 99 separate subsidiary companies, including 57 manufacturing plants who worked throughout the war in Germany alone. It was also in Poland and Czechoslovakia and throughout Eastern Europe. And quite rightly, Unilever was concerned about the perception of an American housewife, let alone what it called in one memo the Jewish grocers who sold its products throughout America. Additionally, Luckman, as the client, credits himself with much of the building's design, saying that by the time of the first meeting of the project with his architects, quote, "I knew exactly what I wanted, a building with materials that emphasized the most modern American technology and offering a genuine American look." Luckman's own biography states that the objective of Lever House was simple, to realize, in his words, millions of dollars in free advertising, which he felt could be realized by building America's first modern post-war office building, which Lever House became when it was built. And he was so certain of the fact that in his meeting that when he flew to London to present the project, he took only two things. He took a plastic large-scale model of the building, which had been designed in the first week of its commissioning, and he took a single typewritten piece of paper that summarized for his bosses at Unilever the millions of dollars in savings in free advertising which Unilever would achieve. His interest was in basically demonstrating that a modern building would become itself a kind of publicity operation in post-war America. And he appropriated, obviously, a kind of prominent ready-made image of modernism itself as a kind of glass box, which is interesting, in the kind of images that are published of it always kind of show, very much like Mies, the old city, and the glass surface sitting next to it is the kind of dazzling new American corporation. This image on the right, just to give you an idea of Fortune's support of the project, is used to illustrate an article on fair trade practices published in Fortune, in which for some reason an image of Lever itself seems satisfactory to demonstrate the possibilities. And as a kind of aside, and it's very much an aside maybe, but it says something about the size of architecture as a kind of discourse, Luckman wasn't entirely wrong in any kind of ambition he had to say that he designed the building. In 1950, he was dismissed from Lever Brothers for letting profits slide in the company. And despite being one of America's most famous young entrepreneurs, launched a second career as an architect, as most of you know, and he became a partner in Pereira and Luckman, and has another kind of interesting connection to Johnson in the sense that he designed in 1954 an image of Seagram Building, which was treated as such a disaster that when Phyllis Lambert saw an image of this model in the Paris edition of the International Herald Tribune, flew home to New York to be by her father's side and to convince her, in fact, to do the project with Mies instead of Luckman. To realize the project, Luckman hired an unexpected architect. It was an architectural office that had never designed, let alone built, a modern office building. The office, of course, is Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Rather than a solitary outsider, Fortune magazine describes SOM's appearance as a company, which it makes clear. The company demonstrates on a grand scale the group approach which they emphasize at every phase in everything from their initial sales pitch to interior decorating details. And this business strategy of SOMs to basically design itself as an office before any of its buildings, in fact, to kind of mirror the companies that they would eventually attract as architects, is summarized most clearly, I think, by Nat Owings in his own biography. Owings is one of the two partners that founded SOM. He says in that, other architects criticize us for the quality of our building design. I say, fine. My job was something else entirely, to design a firm which will last far longer than those architects' buildings. To give you an idea of how different that image of an architect was, at the same time, Frank Lloyd Wright was in New York in the first work on the Guggenheim, and obviously adopting a very different kind of image of what the architect was as a kind of solitary outsider, kind of proto-bohemian, romantic figure from the Wisconsin landscape, which, of course, is precisely the identity which was appropriated by the Gap company in the 1990s to demonstrate, individuality and romantic idea of the individual separate from all other interests. It's kind of interesting that, in fact, when that image of Frank Lloyd Wright was being constructed by Hollywood in the same year as Lever House, one of the nice kind of cross-dressing moments is the fact that they turned Frank Lloyd Wright in the Fountainhead, this is Ayn Rand's Fountainhead, into a figure that looks like he could probably work at SOM. And the architecture also on the right looking a lot more like Lever House than any of Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of work at the time. So with that, let me just say a few things very briefly. One last image of the company and how it's kind of presented. Nat Owings, who's at the head of the table on the right when he's in Florida, bringing his partners together for regular board meetings. At the time, SOM had about 1,000 people in the office, when American architectural offices were about 7.5 people on average working for sole proprietors. SOM had a networked regional base of offices where these 1,000 architects worked, and despite the fact that SOM had never done an office building before Lever, they had grown to that size, of course, for being the kind of ultimate X-Files architects for creating the secret city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Manhattan Project, which is the development of the atomic bomb, was undertaken in the 1940s, and they had kind of grown into this organization out of that. So just briefly about the artifact itself, Lever House. Its first and as I've already said, prominent feature is this all-glass facade, which wasn't just a publicity stunt, but a kind of technological achievement. It is a continuous exterior glass surface consisting of 1,404 glass panels, heat-resistant glass panels, which is suspended from the superstructure, and was the first realized large-scale continuous curtain wall in post-war America. The systematic quality of Lever's curtain wall indicates the speed by which numerous wartime technologies were transferred to domestic post-war markets, which itself accounts for how the mere appearance of curtain walls could so quickly come to signify Americanism, perhaps much more than modernism, during the Cold War years of Lever House. There's an example of that kind of signification. Another image of the curtain wall and its appearance on the right in one of the many issues of architectural magazines which are now promoting it as a major building product. To give an idea of this kind of signification of the curtain wall, which is shown on the right in the image of another of SOM's project, is this kind of newly arrived modern achievement in the historical American city. On the left is an image of Peter Blake's installation for a show in 1957 called America Bout, in which he installed for the primary kind of visitor attraction one-to-one replicas of curtain walls for people to stare at in Berlin, to kind of demonstrate the power of post-war American architecture. And there are many other features of the building, which I won't go through today, which are also kind of interesting technological additions. On the right, its use of the revolving door, for example, as a kind of building product was heralded as an innovation at the time. In addition to the building itself, of course, it houses an endless number of other technological products which are being used by the people inside it. And in addition to a pneumatic mail system, featured continuous fluorescent lighting for the first time as a kind of office standard. And just to show how the publications of this project are somehow embedded with the artifact, it's interesting that in issues of Architectural Forum like this, in which the building is shown in this sort of lit up state, its opposite, a General Electric advertisement for fluorescent lights, establishing a kind of pattern of the convergence between products, artifact, and image that's become a kind of standard in post-war architectural publications. But in addition to these, maybe we could call them technologies of the artifact, I'd just like to say a few things about a different kind of technology that's operating in the building. And these are technologies that you can think of as a kind of extension of the project into a media product itself. And the first of those would be, I think, maybe the large-scale professional architectural model itself as a kind of technological innovation. It was commissioned by Lever House to be built by what became a famous model-making studio in New York. It was actually located across the river in Jersey City, which built a very different kind of description of the building than a traditional architectural drawing. One of its features, which is interesting, that I'll come to at the end of the talk, is the fact that the model shot becomes so incredibly like, of course, the life shot of the building. In fact, kind of blurring the category between the project and its realization, which is as a technology, a key to maybe the second real innovation in terms of these media extensions of Lever House, which of course is the professional architectural photograph, which is another of its stunning capacities. It was the first large-scale commission to a young Ezra Stoller, who became one of the landmark architectural photography studios in New York. And his photos, in fact, become the kind of pattern that's repeated over and over again in the endless images that become Lever House itself. And there's a very kind of constrained palette of images which are then repeated in all of the publications, whether they're newspapers, magazines, or eventually architectural histories. And it becomes, at moments, a kind of free-for-all filmic attempt to capture an object in which it's being described in terms that I think are probably very different than the way buildings were being described at the time. It creates, for example, in image on the left, these kind of peculiar moments that are sorry, I cut it off at the top, but things like the notch, a sort of particular move in the building, which then becomes codified, and in fact demonstrates a kind of convergence of the rise of new media with a different kind of architectural object or space itself, which Philip Johnson actually comments on regarding these kind of publications, in which clearly it's an architectural object published around a combination of image, very small plan, and almost no technical information, to make a distinction from the kind of projects that have been published before this period. A last comment about these extension technologies: they all play a part, the photograph, the model, with this larger operation in place, which of course was American advertising itself. The success of the ad campaign surrounding Lever was confirmed in 1952 when BBD&O and Lever Brothers were awarded the Silver Anvil Trophy for the American Public Relations Association Ad Campaign of the Year, for how it managed the publicity surrounding Lever House. It was a campaign that was managed in a way that was very similar to how BBD&O at the time were inventing other forms of advertising. In 1952, the same year as Lever House, they were packaging a kind of simulated space of post-war America by splicing images of a political candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, with average everyday New Yorkers in the studio, such that it appeared as if there was a kind of conversation going on between the two. And BBD&O's work is considered kind of central to the strategy of Eisenhower winning and the Democrats winning the White House for the first time in 20 years that year. That photography was used in other ways strategically, obviously, by even photographing the building at moments in which it could actually associate itself much more closely to that modern architecture that Lever wanted it to achieve, and also, in a kind of nice twist with Philip Johnson, even photographing the building itself, and this is its lobby on the right, so that it could appear like something like Philip Johnson's own house opened 2 years later in New Haven, Connecticut. Other examples of what the ad agency did, turning it into a kind of generic view of the American office, and then this I'm assuming is Lever House on the left because the guy commenting in the slogan is a cleaner in the street. But a kind of generic image of the gridded office building starts to promote itself all over the American mediascape. And Lever itself becomes a kind of fascinating study in how it promotes the products that are inside it, and turns them into successful building devices. My favorite being this one, a kind of generic fan in the ceilings, or this one, which is toilet valves in the building being used to sell these things as devices for American architects. Just to say briefly, it was also a different project in the sense of constructing a very real difference between inside and outside, and in fact, SOM wasn't commissioned to design the inside of the building. Asked, in fact, only to design its exterior. The interior was designed by Raymond Loewy, the well-known industrial designer, who created a very different kind of world than the one the architects were interested in working on, and in fact suggests in his own writing, in a book on his work in the 1970s, that Lever House itself followed his kind of primary rules in the making of building products, in the making of Lever's other household products. So, that's it really on Lever for now. I'm going to just very briefly mention 4 points that might become the terms for sort of an analysis of this kind of space, trying to make the leap now from the 1940s explosion of media technology to the 1990s version, which it shows some sort of correspondence with. So just very briefly, 4 points. The first point maybe regarding Lever House is that the stuff we call architectural space really does operate as a kind of simulacra today. And while that kind of simulation might have been easier to read 50 years ago, the extent and the complications of it are much harder today. And this is an image from 50 years ago of Jacques Tati's version of Lever House in his famous film Playtime, which was at the time the world's most expensive movie set ever built, which featured this kind of artificial modern city. And 50 years later, an image by Jeff Wall on the right, which has got a kind of nice lever behind it, which is, of course, the famous sort of staged photographs that Jeff Wall puts together, in which this kind of status of what's real, what's choreographed, and what's not is much harder to read. One of the aspects of this thing of architecture as a kind of simulation is obviously a kind of collapse of normal terms of measure or scale or size, and the things we take to be physical objects. Yeah, and sorry, I won't comment on the examples themselves, but a kind of inability to now measure things according to sort of formally stable systems of understanding. One of the ways that's demonstrated in Lever House most directly is the fact that it was actually built to occupy about 25% of its allowable area at the time. Strategically, Lever said, because of course by creating an empty space around it, people could appreciate it more as the kind of trophy that it eventually became. My second point then maybe is linked to that is that the only kind of functionalism that might be left for architects we could probably call something like consumer demand. And built at a time in which there was an incredible need for new office space in Manhattan, when the real estate board that year reported that it was 99.3% occupied already, Lever chooses to build basically an empty site. In fact, never offering really a kind of functional justification for the move of the company to New York itself, which eventually required the dismissal of 90% of its administrative staff from the company it was in, the building it was in before in New York. In fact, the only explanation ever given had to do with advertising itself. As the CEO said, the idea of going to New York was to be close to the agencies so he could push them like hell. At the time, Lever had 7 agencies on retainer, and they operated the world's largest advertising budget. The third point might be that brand space is probably a lot bigger than the stuff we call architectural space today. And maybe one of the ways that Lever suggests that it is in the year of its building, Lever's budget for television advertising was about 3 times the cost of the building that year, which ended up costing $6 million. And it's a kind of feature, this rift between brand space and architectural space, which has probably only exponentially increased since the time of Lever, in the sense that there are companies that now spend $600 to $800 million a year advertising the brand alone and budgeting separate amounts for physical properties, physical facilities. The last point maybe that I like to make is that, and maybe this addresses more the kind of context of the conference, is a kind of complete and utter collapse of space, subject, product, identity, brand construction. This is an image on the left of the clients, designers, and products of Lever, which I think just provides a kind of nice record of the interchangeability of these figures. And on the right, obviously, a more kind of direct example from our time in which there's a very real sense in which this product scape travels across different scales and different domains in the identity of Virgin, for example, going from the scale of the Coke can to the planes that take us to cities built by the same company. So, regarding this point, which is this collapse of space and subject, I thought this would be a nice image to close with, which kind of shows the way the circle has traveled, which from the 1930s, when celebrations were held and architects wore their buildings, basically to celebrate themselves, in the famous image that Rem shows in Delirious New York. On the right is a more recent example of the reversal, in which the building now wears the architect. This is Philip Johnson advertising the opening of one of his buildings in Berlin a couple of years ago. And I was searching for a kind of quote to summarize this kind of fascinating collapse of space and subject or building and person, and I found yesterday, going through articles on the building, a beautiful kind of quote, which is attributed in a 1952 article on Lever to the building itself. In an article in Architectural Forum that quotes the building rather than any of its designers or architects, which is maybe a nice way to close. That quote says, "Here I stand in complete clarity, without mystery. Look, here are my structural columns, my office space, my circulation systems, all visible, evident, and obvious. It's easy to see I am completely expressive of the industrial age. Look at me and I'll reflect back to you your image darkly, but no more dramatically than you would really like to be. My personality is the image of yourself you see in my shining walls." And it's like the building goes through a mirror stage, as a kind of reflective. It's now got to the point where it can actually talk to its readers. My personality is the image of yourself you see in my shining walls as you stand before me in a luxurious suit made in Rochester and wonderful shoes made in St. Louis with an airline ticket to California in your pocket. I'm you. I'm standing here. I'll be standing here when you're gone to say what you were like. I'm you, but I'm bigger than you. Thank you.
This is just before the topic is doubtless returned to more precisely psychoanalytical matters. It's just a bit of historical dotting the I's about Unilever. Your point about the moving of the company to New York. If you go back and you read the history of Unilever, there's a point at which you have to read about when it moved its headquarters from Liverpool to London. And there's a similar kind of sort of lacuna about the motive for that. Having been previously a deeply rooted place, actually built called Sunlight, a soap called Sunlight, and created a community for workers there. And it went from being that kind of company to being a completely delocalized and a globalized company. The other point is, the other product that it was really famous for, apart from soap, was the substitute for butter, namely margarine. And I was reminded of Bart's Operation Margarine, another of his mythologies.
The merger, the reason those two products become central to the company is it's a merger in the 1920s famously between Lever's Empire, founded in this country, and a Dutch magnate in Holland, which were endlessly competing in the first 20 years of the 20th century. They finally decided at some point, or rather the descendants of the original founders decided to simply merge. And Fortune writes about this endlessly because one of the fascinating parts about the merger was, in fact, that the company, it was and remains dually owned for reasons of double taxation between Holland and England, between the two countries. And that boardroom shot that I show at one point of Unilever, this kind of mahogany vessel which is still being used by the company, has a kind of sliding partition with two corporate boardrooms in which the same individuals during their working day would then move to the other side for legal reasons and continue their business and carry on the kind of legacy of both countries. I pulled out the material on Port Sunlight because it becomes a kind of distraction, but one of the other beautiful inventions of William Lever is in fact a kind of model for celebration a century later that Disney would build. He built a kind of beautiful garden city environment on the swampland outside Liverpool for his workers to make them happy, he said at the time, as a kind of philanthropic gesture, which is still considered like the founding of this kind of workers' environment. And sits really as a kind of beautiful mirror image of the shiny object in America, which it sits in corporate terms alongside. Any other questions?
I have one actually, which is really to ask whether the fact that the product is for cleanliness is kind of contingent, or whether you kind of regard it as being kind of central. I mean, on the one hand, you show that there's sort of somehow within all this kind of cleanliness is next to corporateness.
Yeah.
I mean, that takes up a kind of whole theme, psychoanalytic, about intersectionality.
Yeah.
I mean, does intersectionality, which is kind of hijacked by selling soap, relate to the kind of form of mass identification that's building? It feels like very available to such a way of looking at it.
When I was describing at the very beginning, the history I'm trying to write is a kind of episodic thing. I think one of the things I try and say about cleanliness, and I tried obviously not to make the paper a topic on cleanliness. There have been a lot of smart people that have figured cleanliness out as a kind of complication to the world. But what I'm interested in maybe in Lieber is the way in which there's a kind of image of cleanliness that's used simply for the kind of larger operations in play. It happened to be the product the company happened to have a worldwide empire built around, so it became sort of important to them. But I couldn't kind of privilege the concept of cleanliness maybe over an interest in how the forces are at play, these sort of exaggerated forces. I think, and it's played out more recently, for example, in similarly large companies constructing images of uncleanliness as the sort of basis for their products. In the States in the 90s, like the grunge thing, which is funded by David Geffen and his record company in Los Angeles, picked up by Gap, and it becomes the basis for a sort of dirty look. And then there's a kind of, it's more, what I was trying to get at is more the way in which space is constructed through a series of forces that are maybe not unlike the subject.
It has to be like a kind of dirty look. It can't be actually like buy our clothes, they really smell disgusting.
Yeah.
And I mean, the point about Lieber, I mean, seems, in terms of like a larger context of urban history, I mean, as part of an entire narrative about, at one of the same time, a thinking process which represses the olfactory,
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful because it would have a kind of reading in this project for being one of America's first entirely air-conditioned buildings. It's because of the sealed facade and the potential for heat gain, SOM created an expensive system for air conditioning the entire structure, which also, in addition to kind of distancing the inside and outside even further, providing an environment that's so artificial that the air itself has now been mechanized, would kind of perfectly confirm your sense of the visual bias of cleanliness demanding a kind of compensating removal of the olfactory completely as a sort of sense, which is obviously one of the histories maybe in modernism that hasn't, in architecture especially, been written through.
Okay, well, for a more I didn't talk to this. I think we just broke within a few minutes to let people kind of stretch their legs, but actually, we can start getting in 5 minutes, right? Very quickly, yeah.
The phenomena that you expose as a believer are being through the same phenomena around the world, which is by paranoia hygiene industry, which began after the war. What I can see as different is that in the case of Unilever, was not a man, the defined man, which went into architecture, made a building or something to relate to the products. That was an enterprise, a company.
Yeah.
But what happened around the world was normally that personal people would want to promote themselves with the result, the positive result, and then short. In case in the leader, they tend to make an interest as a company related to architecture. And then that was with the person. And what made me feel that architecture is no personal thing. It has to do with always something very strong behind it. When you relate to the personal person, never to see properly.
What would I relate to the person that's being acted on in this sort of a situation?
Yeah, never is very difficult to relate architecture with an individual.
Yeah.
And always related to the
Well, I think it was difficult. I mean, at a certain level, it's difficult, but you could kind of do the flip side and say that it's actually been very easy with a very similar kind of building, which I would take something like Bilbao to be, to in fact associate an architecture very closely to an individual, to the point that someone like Frank Gehry is in the headlines you read, as he says, sort of living his dream. You know, that there isn't a kind of, it's in effect, there's a kind of near side where you could argue it's constructing, there's a series of competing interests maybe in a tourist economy that weren't in a consumer economy that are in fact constructing the association between the individual architect and the project much more closely than at a moment like this, which was constructing the architectural object in a kind of modern American corporation, which I think would account for, you know, the Herzog effect or the Bilbao effect of there being a kind of signature style as the brand now, in a way that this was a kind of distribution of technologies as the brand this company was working on, which is operating in a similar way. You know, and for that reason, I think something to be skeptical of it itself, to not sort of privilege as the sort of thing that's going to save all of this sort of evil stuff. It's much more than they're just a series of forces in play, and one of the things I was maybe trying to do is to just show that those construct a kind of space or a kind of architecture that can be seen to somehow operate within those larger fields and not just be a kind of arrival, a thing that, like as architectural historians write, it just sort of arrives. Lieberhouse arrives in 1952.
Okay, well, we'll break for 5 minutes and then come back for another. Thank you very much.
Thank you.